All right, guys, we're going to look at the Civil War and Reconstruction in Mississippi. Before we actually get into it, I need to give you a little background, which is not going to be on our PowerPoint here. It will be kind of separate from the PowerPoint. But I want you to go ahead and make sure that you write down in your notebook the essential question for section 1, which is going to be, how did strategies change as battles were fought during the Civil War? We're going to specifically look at the beginning of this, how the war started, and then we're going to get into the battle at Shiloh, which was outside of Mississippi, but was a pivotal part in the Union soldiers and the Union generals getting into Mississippi during the Civil War. And then from there, we'll continue on and talk about specific events that took place here, like the Battle of Vicksburg. So here's some terms that we're going to go over as we are going through these notes, and we'll talk about them as we get to them. So the first slide really is not got a lot of information on it that's going to be in your guided notes. Basically what our guided notes are talking about is on February 4th, 1861, South Carolina, Mississippi, Georgia, Alabama, Florida, Louisiana, and Texas established what was known as the Confederate States of America. If you remember from the last section that we talked about, we discussed how they had the Ordinance of Secession, and when they had the Ordinance of Secession, it was decided that we would secede, but South Carolina was the first one to secede, and then after that, Mississippi, Georgia, Alabama, Florida, Louisiana, and Texas joined. After we seceded and we formed the Confederate States of America, Jefferson Davis, who was from Mississippi, was named the president of the Confederacy. There was several discussions back and forth between Davis and Lincoln as to whether or not we wanted to go to war, how to handle the idea of secession. Lincoln obviously did not want secession to happen, but the South was adamant about keeping their slaves. And because they were adamant about that, the secession went ahead and took place. So what ends up happening is the Union soldiers kind of kept from supplies coming into military bases that were technically Union military bases still in the South. And one specific was Fort Sumter, which was located in South Carolina. So on April 12th, 1861, the Confederates fired on the Union military base at Fort Sumter. This is in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina. After the firing on Fort Sumter, the Union Navy blockaded the southern coastline, which is the Atlantic Ocean. And if you don't know what a blockade is, it is number 5. It says this blockade used of naval forces to isolate a seaport and prevent ships from entering or leaving the port. And so this made it where it was hard for them to bring supplies in and out of these specific areas. Now, a lot of the soldiers that were actually in the fort were Confederate soldiers. So it ends up that they actually take the ones that didn't want to secede, that were still considered part of the Union, and held them prisoner. Fort Sumter actually was won by the Confederacy, and so a lot of people felt like that the Confederates had a chance of winning a war potentially against the Union soldiers. But as we progress into specifically Mississippi history, we're going to see that there was a series of events that took place that made that not possible. So when the war started, the military strategy that was come up with by the Union was they wanted to divide and isolate large portions of the South. On a map, which I have one, or I'm going to pull one up real quick so you can see. On the map, we're going to see here in just a second that what their plan was specifically was to separate the southern states from other states. So I'm going to enlarge this, pull it forward. Here we go. So if we look on this map right here, their goal was, let's separate specifically the Mississippi River from this portion over here, the western portion of the South that has seceded, from the rest of this over here. And then another idea that they had was that they wanted to destroy the railroads that were located in the South. A lot of major rail lines were located here in the South during this time period, and that's how supplies were coming in and out and how we were actually getting cotton to and from the South. And so with this idea, they decided, hey, if we do this, then there's the probability that we will be able to keep supplies from coming in and out. So the military strategy was to divide and isolate large areas of the South by destroying the Southern Railroad system and controlling the Southern rivers. So this complex military campaign came up with the idea that Vicksburg needed to be captured. It was one of the main cities that sat on the Mississippi River, and so if they could capture Mississippi, then that would initially end up helping the Union gain control of the Mississippi River. So that was their main objective. All right, so soldiers were under the control or under Ulysses S. Grant, general. He was the general at the time. And so they started marching towards Vicksburg. They established a post outside of Vicksburg and Holly Springs. But before they got there, they actually had to come across on the Tennessee River. And after they came across on the Tennessee River, they had to march through the northern portion of Mississippi. So what happens is... here we go. Number 7, in a complex military campaign designed to capture Vicksburg and to control the Mississippi River, Union naval forces launched a coordinated attack against ports of New Orleans and Memphis. Okay, so that's one of the first steps that he did. And then the next thing that he did is he actually went in and started trying to take over major cities through the northern part of the state. So while these naval battles were taking place, Union soldiers under General Ulysses S. Grant were marching through Tennessee and Mississippi on their way to Vicksburg. Grant's army assembled a supply depot in Holly Springs and a bivouac, which is a camp with shelter, not much shelter, but some shelter, in Oxford in the fall of 1862. All right, so a Confederate raid ended up happening in Holly Springs, and it destroyed pretty much all the supplies that Grant had gathered, and they were stranded. They couldn't move past move on forward towards Vicksburg at this point. Now, this became partly an issue because they ended up having to retreat back north into Tennessee. The Confederate soldiers were told to protect the railroad intersection that was known as the Crossroads of the South. Now, the Crossroads of the South was actually in Corinth, Mississippi, was just across the state line from Tennessee, where Shiloh was located. And so what happens is Grant's men are on one side of the Tennessee River, waiting to cross the Tennessee River to come through Shiloh and down into Corinth so they can get rid of this crossroads, the railroad. All right, so what ends up happening is there's a Confederate army that was actually camped out at Shiloh, and Grant didn't know it. So the battle starts taking place. He retreats after the first day of fighting because they don't have the supplies that they need. So what ends up happening is another group of Union soldiers meet up with Grant. And when they meet up with Grant, the Confederates are not aware that they're going to re-attack them. And so the Battle of Shiloh becomes one of the bloodiest battles of the whole entire Civil War. So number 11, in early April 1862, Confederate troops intercepted General Grant's army northeast of Corinth at Shiloh, Tennessee. The fighting lasted until late afternoon, and Shiloh became one of the bloodiest battles of the Civil War. So after this was won, Grant moved into Corinth. So it says on April 7th, the battle changed, and the General Grant's army, who had been reinforced overnight, ended up winning that battle. So he resumed his march towards Vicksburg. This put him into Corinth. They tore up all the rail lines in Corinth, making it impossible for supplies to come through there. So on April 7th, Grant's army, which had been reinforced, turned the tides against the Confederate. The Confederates had 11,000 casualties, which are people who are killed or wounded during the battle, and the Union had 13,000. So that's why they call it one of the bloodiest battles. After the Battle of Shiloh, Grant resumed his march towards Vicksburg. As he started heading towards Vicksburg, he was trying to come up with a strategic plan to take Vicksburg over very quickly. Unfortunately, Grant didn't know how or why or what way to do this because Vicksburg is located on a really high bluff. And because of this really high bluff, it made it really hard for them to be able to shoot towards the Confederate soldiers who had taken up their location or their camp spot on top of this bluff. So the Battle of Vicksburg ends up being a lot longer than what they actually expected it to be. So the Confederates not only had the opportunity of this bluff, but they also were on the Mississippi River, and they had batteries, which were sets of big guns to use as an attack and defense. So any boats that came at them that were Union boats, they shot at the Union boats. So Vicksburg's strategic location on the high bluffs above the sharp bend in the river gave its shore batteries sets of big guns used for attack or defense, control over the traffic up and down the great river Mississippi. So this worked pretty good for the Confederacy for a while, but it was very important that the Union military capture Vicksburg. This was part of the initial plan that they were going for. And so they have to come up with a new idea. And that idea was David Farragut. David Farragut was actually a naval captain. He captured New Orleans in 1862. He continued to sail his fleet up the Mississippi River, taking Baton Rouge. Eventually, he took Natchez. And so as he's moving along, his idea is he's going to join the forces in Vicksburg. So it says David Farragut, a veteran flag officer, captured New Orleans on May 1st, 1862, and then he sailed his fleet up the Mississippi River to capture Natchez. And when he got to Vicksburg, federal gunboats joined them. These were called ironclads, and we'll talk more about those later this week. And so they started attacking the city. Farragut realized that he couldn't take the city by boat like he had all of the others. So him and Grant come up with the idea to dig a canal around the city, but because the city sat on top of this bluff, that was a failed plan as well. So Farragut had to forget about how to attack Vicksburg, and he actually had to retreat back south down the river towards Natchez again because they were pretty much at a loss and he didn't know what to do. So October 14th, 1862, General John C. Pemberton was ordered to hold Vicksburg at all costs. So he was the Confederate soldier put in charge, and he was told to just hang on to Vicksburg. And so he tried his hardest, believe it or not. He worked really hard to try to keep Vicksburg free and clear of the Union soldiers. But unfortunately, we know from history that it failed. He was given a hopeless assignment to make things worse. He would soon have to meet up with the Union Army. So in December of 1862, Grant resupplies his army at his depot in Holly Springs, and he starts marching towards Vicksburg. That December, his army moves south and occupied Oxford. And while he was doing this, he had command of his troops, and General William T. Sherman moved south and occupied Oxford with Grant. All right, so Grant's wife and her son came and spent Christmas with him. On December 20th, the Confederate cavalry tried to kidnap Miss Grant. They were unsuccessful at this, and there was just enough warning to get her and her son out of Holly Springs before the Confederate troops actually came in to attack. He eventually lost the supply base at Holly Springs again, and he sent his men out in a 15-mile radius to find food. They brought back tons of food, and he figured out that he could live off the land with his troops easily. So this discovered and shaped the future of the military campaigns for the Union. So when we finish this section talking about it in class, you will come back to me with questions after you do this, and we will discuss those, and then we'll get started on the Vicksburg campaign in class, hopefully as soon as possible. All right, thanks, guys.